Thank you and welcome to the Dartmouth Round the Girdle to Earth North America Fall 2020 webinar on Powering the Future in the New Energy World. As a reminder, this event is being recorded. My name is April Salas, Executive Director of the Revers Center for Energy at the Tuck School of Business, and I would like to start by welcoming all of you and saying thank you to Lee Sallin, Dartmouth's class of 79, Tuck class of 84, former CEO of GE Canada, and the Canadian Regional Campaign Committee of Dartmouth. I'd also like to thank the McCullough Program on Canadian-American Relations at the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, and in particular, Melody Berkins, Associate Director at the Dickey Center, Adjunct Professor of Environmental Studies and Senior Fellow at the Dartmouth and Arctic Institute of Arctic Policy. And lastly, but not the very least, the Irving Institute for Energy and Society, the Tuck Revers Center for Energy, and all of our engaged board members and alumni of Dartmouth, Tuck, Thayer in the US, Canada, and around the world. Thank you all and welcome. As moderator, I am thrilled to share the virtual stage with tonight's powerhouse panel of alumni, leaders, and change makers. We have Steve Dowd, a Tuck class of 90, Chief Investment Officer of Private Infrastructure Strategies at CBRE Global Investors. We have Abby Hopper joining us, a Dartmouth class of 93, President and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association. Steve Malnight, Tuck class of 2002, CEO and President of Duquesne Light Company. Elizabeth Wilson, Director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. And Michael Bernstein, Dartmouth class of 91, President of Juno Advisors. So the format of this evening's webinar is 3 framing questions to 2 of our 5 experts who will kick the conversation off, followed by a 10-minute discussion amongst the panel. So to our audience members, don't hesitate to queue your questions up in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, from which I will select 2 to 3 questions to pose to the panel. So let's get started. All right, so on January 21st, the Biden administration will formally take office in the United States. In reading the Biden climate plan, I think it's safe to assume that we may expect the incoming administration to quickly change the energy and climate policies of the Trump administration, focusing actively on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, creating more low carbon economy jobs, as well as focusing heavily on climate justice and environmental equity. This year, Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, also invested $1.7 billion in emissions reductions fund to help out oil and gas workers get back to work, cleaning up tens of thousands of leaky abandoned wells. This is also coupled with a $750 million fund to reduce methane and other pollution from oil and gas infrastructure, expected to create up to an additional 10,000 jobs and has helped stabilize the climate. Yet his administration has remained part of the Paris Climate Agreements and works to navigate the needs of traditional energy producers across the nation, which demands for renewable energy and greenhouse gas emission reductions. So with this current landscape, let's go ahead and dive into our first question. So for Elizabeth and Steve Dowd, can you start us off by framing the current landscape of the US-Canadian energy systems in the context of global markets, cross-border trade, the ever-changing regulatory environment? What opportunities and constraints should we be following?
I really want to thank you, April, for that great question to kick off. And I really would just like to contextualize this a little bit, recognizing that many people in the United States don't recognize that Canada is the US's largest energy trade partner, with bilateral trade at $119 billion in 2019. And this trade spans oil, where over 5 million barrels per day in crude oil come from Canada to the US, 10 billion cubic feet of natural gas, and 74 terawatt hours of electricity. So oil, gas, and electricity going back and forth between the 2 countries. And really from an energy marketplace where I study, the links between Canadian hydro, whether it's in BC, whether it's in Ontario, whether it's Quebec, and the markets in the United States have really proven to be, Manitoba as well, have really proven to be really important for thinking about integrating greater percentages of renewables, variable renewable resources into the grid. And it's just such an exciting time to think about what some of those opportunities are. And of course, we can also discuss constraints, but I'll leave that to Stephen.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for having us here and listening to us. I think that the big theme, whether it's North American or global, right now is energy transition. Everywhere around the world, we're talking about decarbonization, change to the energy environment. But I just ran across an interesting stat, or at least projection, that in 2050, McKinsey is still expecting about 2/3 of the world's energy to come from traditional fossil fuel sources. So we have this tension around pressure to decarbonize, yet a need and an underlying demand for traditional energy. I think Western countries, Canada and the U.S., are going to be ahead of other parts of the world, and our share of renewables will be higher, and the part of the economy that's going to be associated with traditional fuels is going to be lower. And as an investor, what we're looking at is, what does this mean to the sector? Where are we going to put our capital and our clients' capital? And our clients are frankly a little afraid of what happens in traditional sectors. And I think the cost of capital that comes from the investment sector is going to rise, and in fact has risen for traditional sectors, and it's come down for the renewable sector. And that's going to be an important theme that will affect parts of the North American energy economy. It's going to affect growth. It's going to strand certain assets in the economy. I would just say that the direction of play is clear over the next few years and few decades, but the speed at which that transition happens is the big question.
And I just want to say that I think we'd be remiss at this very beginning section. I mean, we often talk about national energy policy, but I think when talking both about Canada as well as the United States, it's really important to realize the role of the provinces as well as the states in determining energy policy and actually deploying projects and actually building infrastructure. And so we have a lot of our general ideas of how the system is going to work, but actually the very different provincial politics across the Canadian provinces and across the US states really allows different types of capital flow and business models to go in much more easily than others. And so I think that's something that we're going to see more of. And what I really appreciate here is we have many different kind of Canadian perspectives as different American perspectives here too. So I look forward to that regionalization of the conversation being part of what we're able to bring to the conversation tonight.
Michael, any thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. Two themes that I think are absolutely true, which is just how different by province it is and by state. So we still have out west where we have Alberta and Saskatchewan, which is still predominantly coal-fired electricity, and Quebec or Ontario, BC, which is almost exclusively renewable or nuclear, but non-carbon emitting. The other thing, one of the bit of work that I do is working with pension funds and large investors and financial institutions. And I'm not sure how big it is in the US, but the ESG issue and the binary flow of capital that Steve was alluding to is just in the last 12 months just becoming such an important consideration. There are now many lenders as well as investors who will just not invest at all in anything carbon related and are just fleeing the fossil industry. And if you look at valuations for companies and you're looking at the multi-billion-dollar write-offs that you would have seen recently from some large integrated oil companies, that is something to watch carefully, because you have politics, but when you have capital flows that either flow into an industry or out of others, then that can really have an accelerating impact.
Does the panel see a role for technology enhancements, increased efficiency in the oil and gas sector to particularly feed into, what I think you guys are alluding to as some of the stranded assets, or did I read that wrong?
I think oil and gas sector is going to have to take a look at, carbon capture technologies, for regulatory purposes, sort of methane. The Trump administration, loosened methane emissions out of that industry. We'll probably see those tightened by Biden administration. Same thing will happen in Canada. So, they're going to be regulatory impacts that focus the industry on greater efficiency and will require them to bring technology around. But also it's that cost of capital as well that's going to make it very important and make it more profitable for them or to actually implement those.
And Steve Malnight, in your experience, how are you looking at, power generation assets? Is that factored into this sort of transition that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the things that's fascinating to me, you started off this question with highlighting, we're going to have a Biden administration come in and clearly bringing a different policy perspective than we've seen over the last 4 years. But one of the things I think is kind of fascinating is I think that transition from a policy perspective is actually going to have less of an effect than we typically would have thought it would. And the reason is really twofold. I think one is the one we've talked about here with the regionalization of policy and the fact that, candidly, I think, expecting a unified national energy policy out of Washington is probably being overly ambitious, regardless of who's in the White House. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, is just, this issue is sort of moved beyond the realm of just national policy. I remember when I, in a prior role, was in Bonn, Germany during the COP conference after the Trump administration had come in, when the Trump administration sent what was a pretty junior member of the administration versus Paris being there before. And candidly, we were with a bunch of cities, states, companies, all saying, we're still in. And the policy drive was really being driven at these regional and local and frankly in boardroom kinds of conversations. And I think that's going to continue and just continue to accelerate. The other fact is the technology costs for these these clean technologies have dramatically changed. I remember in 2008 working in California on renewable energy procurement and looking at some pretty scary prices for solar energy in California, a great solar resource state, but still looking at several $100s a megawatt hour to buy long-term solar. I mean, solar today is cheaper than most other generation resources out there. So frankly, it doesn't matter what the policy is. Solar is going to grow because it's economically advantageous to grow. So I actually think that, the thing I find fascinating is I candidly just think the change in administration is probably going to have less of an effect than we think, because this momentum is already moving. It's survived, what is a pretty hostile 4 years towards clean energy policy, and it's continued and it's going to keep going and keep accelerating. So that's good for the markets. It's good for business because, as a company that's investing long-term assets, the last thing you want is to have a completely new energy policy every 4 years that makes a decision look bad 4 years after you made it. But I don't think that's the reality we face. I think we face, declining technology costs, strong policy support, sort of top to bottom, and frankly, an investment commitment from financing entities to continue to push these clean technologies for all the right reasons. So that's a good thing, I think, for all of us.
Abby, do you feel that from the solar industry? I saw you come off mute. I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, no, so I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. It feels like it's going to be really different from where I sit. So I had the privilege of leading the solar industry over the last 4 years, and there were so many more headwinds, I think, than we could have even anticipated. And so clearing out some of that with the new administration will be good. I forget which Steve said it, but I think Steve Dowd said it about talking about the pace of the transition, right? And I think that's where a different administration can make a pretty significant change. It's because I agree with you. The market has spoken, right? The market has spoken, the finance community has spoken, the investment community has spoken, customers have spoken, employees have spoken, pension funds have spoken. Like, we know where we're headed. Are we going to get there tomorrow, or are we going to get there in 3 decades? And that's I think, where the policy levers really matter. Absolutely agree that the states and regionals and locals make a huge difference, but the federal policy, if we can, I agree. I've lived here my whole life, except for when I lived in Hanover. we can't look to the federal government for holistic energy policy, but we can look to them for investments in R&D, for investments in deployment, investments in workforce development, which is going to be a huge piece. You talked a little bit about the sort of Canadian model of putting oil and gas workers back to work, but also, I don't know, a stable tax regime, a stable trade policy, right? Where we invest in things that we care about, not because we would like to wish them into action, but because they will actually happen. So I do think that a Biden administration will make a difference, but I would agree with Steve that there are already so many other factors that are making this transition happen. And I come from, I have my solar hat on right now. You might not see it, it's invisible, but I have worked in a whole bunch of different industries, like renewable and non-renewable, and there is a clear transition. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit, about sort of corporate appetite for these things, and it's a huge part of the equation.
Are there specific policies or sort of stabilization of, like you said, tax or financial regimes that you think the industry is awaiting, or do you think we've seen that headwind and it's been enough to ignite the momentum within the renewable sector?
Both. I think both. I think so. I will break news, which next week we'll release our Q3 report on the state of the solar industry. And so far, we're projected to grow 43% year over year in 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, stay-at-home orders, shutdown orders, everyone sort of navigating the new normal, whether it's you can't sell, you can't install, or all of your employees are home because their kids are home, right? Like whatever version of that impacted you, we're still growing 43% year over year. So, we have factored in sort of this declining tax credit that we have, this trade policy that's been challenging, and if we want to build back better, if we want to put people back to work, if we want to hasten our transition to a just, equitable, and carbon-free future, then we're investing in solar, we're investing in wind, we're investing in offshore, we're investing in carbon sequestration. And so those are the areas, and sometimes it's tax policy, sometimes it's R&D, sometimes it's deployment help, but that's what we're looking for.
That's fantastic news. Very excited to hear. It might be the best news of 2020. I don't know. Is that being driven at sort of utility scale? Is that more in the distributed sense? Is that the corporates leading the way? Where is that growth coming from? It's
so interesting. So you could imagine that Q2, the residential market went right as everyone stayed home. So they had a huge decline. They're on the upswing now. About 70% of the growth this year is from the utility scale market. But still, vibrant community solar, vibrant corporate, on top of your Target store, and vibrant resi. The corporates are definitely a driver, but they're not the only driver. I'm excited to get to the greenwashing conversation because I got a lot of thoughts about that. But they are certainly their procurement is important.
Let's dive into that question. That's where I wanted to head next. And we've already talked about some of these 2030 and 2050 targets. Hanover actually is the first, city in the state of New Hampshire to endorse such a target for our community-wide efforts across thermal, transportation and electricity. So we're very familiar with that here, and really excited to be talking about it. But you guys have already mentioned it. Countries, companies, local governments are setting these policy goals to mitigate greenhouse gas and carbon in their operations, aligning with global agreements like the Paris Climate Accords, and increasingly factoring in ESG, which we've already heard, brought up. So that's being led now by investors and the C-suite. As the U.S. is expected to rejoin, I think that signal's already been made, the global agreement soon, and Canada really never left. How do we tell what's greenwashing, what's measurable impact, and kind of learning from either, like you said, that the growth never slowed down, and Canada never left. So what are the things that we can learn with this positive momentum and or 4-year head start on setting targets and meeting goals? And I'll turn that to Michael and to Abby.
Yeah. So what's very fascinating is there's two countries, and let's go back to whether it's Rio in 92 or Kyoto 95, Copenhagen before that would start to really focus on carbon and climate, and obviously Paris. And we talk about how Canada has never left, and we're good corporate citizens and still believe in international agreements. But over the last 20 years, there is one country that has kept carbon emissions flat. And there's another country that has reduced carbon emissions by 20%. And lo and behold, it's Canada that's been flat, and it's the US that's reduced it. And it's reduced it for what I'll say is economic reasons, and Steve talked about that, which is a shift from coal, notwithstanding government over the last 4 years federally that was trying to support the industry, to first natural gas, which is, I believe, half as carbon intense as coal, and then more recently over to wind and to solar. And so when you take a step back, it's wonderful that you have federal leaders, provincial leaders, even civic leaders, because City of Toronto, we have now codes for housing and how to make housing more energy efficient, and that's a big driver. But what really changes dynamics are what customers and consumers and businesses do. And when the economics line up with good, sound environmental policy, and you start thinking about pricing in carbon as an exogenous negative force, then you have these positive things happen. So I think what's really interesting to see is that there's a lot of hand-wringing in the US about all the things that have gone wrong, particularly over the last couple of years. But if I think about tax equity, if I think what's been happening at the state level, if I think about, and Steve mentioned carbon sequestration and storage, and the impact of 45Q, the US is by far the best and most advanced market for CCS, even double what China is. So the US, in spite of all these issues, are doing a lot of things right. And Abby talked about just how solar is proliferating. So it'd be wonderful to see if everything gets aligned, but announcements don't mean anything. Signing international accords don't mean anything. And you can ask the Europeans about what they think about Boris Johnson's signature on agreements. And policy is great. And even regulation and legislation is wonderful to have, but you want it to align with economics. And then therefore, if the economics, and driven partly by tax policy and by what investors are doing, that's where the rubber hits the road. And I think Canada has done a much better job of virtue calling, but not as much about making the economics work. And the US has done the opposite, but have made the economics work.
One of my favorite comments from a researcher colleague of mine was, rate making is social policy. And this goes to Michael's comment of aligning these different structures. And in some of our earlier research, we looked at MISO and how they developed their rules for the dispatchable intermittent resources program that allowed wind and solar to bid into markets. This was huge for Manitoba and the hydro coming down from Canada into the markets, and how it was used to back this up. And really these negotiations of these market policies, these rate-making structures within the electricity markets are some of the ones that are allowing for these transformations to happen, both for individual corporate customers, but also for huge swaths of technologies to really play a much, much larger role than we ever imagined before. And I always point out to my students that, back in for the 2000 annual energy outlook, the US, when they ran the NEMS model projecting, 2000 to 2020, they projected on the base case scenario that the US over that 20-year period cumulatively would build 800 megawatts of wind. Right? We, the experts, were wrong by 2 orders of magnitude. I mean, that's what gives me hope here. And that's what makes me think, Steve, that maybe this transition could be a lot faster than any of we experts can even imagine. And at a certain point, you're just hanging on, and things that were impossible are now daily practice, and no one even blinks. So that story and that Canadian-US relationship here has been absolutely critical for meeting a lot of these goals. And so, well, Michael, I see what you're saying. Canadian hydro, whether it be in BC or in Manitoba, has been critical both for West Coast, but also for Midwest renewables to be able to play these larger roles in the market.
That's so interesting. I actually use that, whatever the solar equivalent is, I can't remember right now, in my big SPI speech last year, because we were so wrong. We were so wrong. We grew like 93 times what we anticipated we were going to grow.
Our liberty comes from our ignorance.
Yeah, we're not limited by any of that. So sort of proof points and your question about whether this is greenwashing or whether this is genuine. In some ways, I don't really care, honestly. Like, they're still buying the electrons, right? And they're still building power plants, and I'm cool with that. But what I see, actually, I noticed a couple things. One is certainly the big corporates that have buying. They don't just have buying power, but they have location power. And so I'm sure that Steve had these calls when he was in California. Well, you're in San Francisco, but like, if you're in Tennessee and Google wants to come and build a big data center, they are going to demand certain regulatory constructs and structures and access to clean energy, or they're not coming there. And so they actually have engaged in MISO, engaged in PJM, engaged in those energy markets in a much more sophisticated way. And I think, to me, that proves that it's not just greenwashing. I also have had opportunity to talk with a bunch of them about the kind of structures they're doing. You know, they're not just pushing the regulatory envelope, but they're pushing sort of the social construct envelope. We had a discussion with Microsoft the other day. They announced a 500 megawatt project offtake, but part of that is a community benefit agreement. And so in the communities where they're building, they're investing dollars that the community can direct. And so it's more than simply like signing a PPA, right? Which makes me think it's not just greenwashing. But I also, in a different hat I had on once, had a ton of engagement with oil and gas companies, and they are now in my world again, right? So Shell and Shell New Energy is investing in electric vehicles, storage, offshore wind, solar. Ørsted is, completely divesting from all carbon manufacturing. Well, it's not called Stata. They've all renamed because they don't want to have the word oil in their name anymore. Equinor, right? Equinor, like when I had my last hat on, they paid hundreds of millions of dollars for their offshore wind lease off the coast of New York. And so those are not small amounts of capital. Those are not particularly sort of liberal in terms of throwing their money around kind of companies. Those are calculated, tactical, thoughtful investments they're making. And I'm watching the big oil and gas majors come in. I now have BP and Shell and a couple other oil companies on my board for the Solar Energy Industries Association, because they see where the market's going.
I think this point about, is it greenwashing or is it real? Again, from an investment standpoint, and Mike talked about it early on. We talked to large investors around the world, and if you looked at it 3, 4, 5 years ago, they would ask a question of us, right? What are your ESG policies? And he answered in 2 sentences and then fine, check mark. Now when we respond, and this is wherever it is in the world, when we respond, there is a page of questions, and there's about 20 pages of a 100-page document that you're responding on. How do you invest? And all of the pension funds are looking for their managers and looking for where their money is going to go about strong ESG policies, and they're looking to see how it's actually implemented, and what the backup is for that, and what the depth of that commitment is. They're excluding certain sectors, and they're worried about both the investment they're making, whether it's the oil and gas business, but also the resilience around certain assets because of climate change. So there's a lot of depth, and I think greenwashing is less and less of an issue. Again, coming whether it's the corporates as Abby was talking about, or whether it's the sources of capital as we see every day in our work. It's robust work that's being done around figuring out what's actually there.
Would you say the pressure for that is being driven by the funds themselves, by the consumers? We talked about all the people who have made their voice heard, that this is what they would like to see in the industry. Where do you see that pressure coming from? Is it on the investor? Is it on the LPs? Who's wagging the dog?
So it's definitely the pension funds. It's the investors are pushing this, and there's certain ones that are out front, and some of the larger institutional pools of capital. So the big California plans, for instance, big New York plans, they're out front with strong policies, and they're asking for their managers in whatever business they happen to be in, not just the infrastructure business like myself, but across the board. I'm part of a big real estate organization. Their real estate investments all have to be, carbon neutral buildings, or how are you moving to net zero, all these sorts of things. So it's very much that. Sometimes it's because it's, their public pension plan and there's policy. Sometimes it's because, maybe they're a union-based teachers. A lot of times are very active in these areas. But a lot of it is more about the fact that, these big funds are looking out 40, 50, 70 years plus, and they're looking at, what are the risks to their investments. And these are all really climate risks, or really long-term risks. And they want to make sure that where they're putting their money is having an influence on the outcomes they're going to have from their investments over the long term.
And for this is really a generic question for anyone, but we've been talking a lot about this at Tuck and even at the Irving Institute. How do you think companies or fund managers are thinking about climate risk? How are they having that conversation? Like, what are the sort of key criteria, and is that being led from the C-suite, from sort of strategic and operation? Is it off to the side? We know Shell's investing billions. Is that core to its, central of its business, or still kind of an offshoot? What do you guys think about how companies are viewing climate risk? And I don't want to call it greenwashing, but, how serious do we think it is?
I'll just say, in the last 12 months, I've worked with the European, North American, as well as an Australian investors and entities. And it's very much at the C-suite and at the board level. And if the C-suite's not paying attention, the board is asking them to look at it. But I'm not sure if I might be penalized here, but I do have a bit of a concern that it is becoming too ideological, which is carbon bad, can't do it. It's all about abatement. It's all about net zero. And it's just like someone telling me I can never eat another French fry or can't have any ice cream. Like, that'd be okay as long as it's balanced, as long as I go work out and balance it. And, Steve, there's a lot of reasons why fossil fuels are useful and are cost effective. So I think we need to be a little bit careful that we just don't think about abatement strategy, and CCS is obviously one of them, but planting trees, other things that get us to our actual targets, which is not necessarily not having any other carbon ever emitted. Otherwise, the poor sheep in New Zealand would be gone. But it's to have an ecosystem that can manage it in an environmentally sustainable way. So right now, I do have a concern that the pendulum is just too far, and we're not thinking about the overall economics and other investments, technologies, strategies that can get us to where we want to be from a global emissions perspective. And that, in my mind, still includes, in certain circumstances, fossil fuels, but at a much lower level than today. And certainly things like coal, without CCS, it becomes very difficult to justify.
First, I want to know how Michael knew I had ice cream and French fries for dinner, but we can save that for later. But one of the pieces that I think I want to make sure we address in this is something that in this last year feels like we've been pounded over the head with. As somebody who's originally from California, watching my home state on fire the last couple of years has been incredibly hard. And we had 30 named storms. Climate change is coming at us, and unless adaptation is also part of this conversation, the piece that I am recognizing more and more is that our system is built for a world that we are not adapted to, that our systems are not adapted to. We have trillions of dollars of infrastructure that really aren't geared for what is coming. When I talk to our Dartmouth climate modeler, Eric Osterberg, he talks about even here in the upper New England, we're looking at more extreme rainfall events and more extreme droughts. There's no fire hydrant on the highway. I mean, New England has never had to deal with fires for the last couple hundred years. And so we're moving into a world that none of us are prepared for. And one of the things that really strikes me is in the academic literature, there are lots of articles about climate risk in the electricity sector. And yet when I go to the websites of the RTOs, and I have students who were doing this last term, or the utilities, and look for a drought, look for a fire, look for these types of climate risks, with the exception of New York, there's very little out there. And so for me, there's a bit of a gap, and it's great to have these conversations about mitigation and technology, but unless we're coupling them with the adaptation and the equity conversation, we're missing where the real problem is. And I just want to make sure that we're looking at the ball that's coming at our heads, because your energy system reliability goes down considerably when your substation is underwater or your transmission tower is on fire. Just, personal experience, I can speak to this. So I just want to make sure when we're thinking about this relationship between Canada, between US and this change, we're really grounding not only in the reduced carbon story, which Michael, I think, articulated very well, but also the fact that we're adapting to a world of pain that we don't really yet understand. And how we engage our communities and our corporations and our financial structures to actually incorporate that risk. I mean, rebuilding houses 6 times is not a sustainable strategy. So I just want to leave with that, and I'd love any thoughts you have, because for me, it's beyond greenwashing. It's a more fundamental shift in how we need to really re-engage with our orientation on this problem.
April, I don't mean to be directive. I would love to hear what Steve Malnight would say about that, right? Like, you're running a utility. How are you thinking about these things?
Yeah, and
that's exactly where I was going. Steve.
Okay, sorry.
Thanks, Abby, for emceeing here. It's interesting. I was just listening to Elizabeth, and I totally agree. But just to pull a couple threads of this together, I do believe, number one, we've got to start focusing on mitigation and what does adaptation look like? What does mitigation look like? Broader than just eliminate all carbon and everything will be fine. Because you're right, that's not the reality of the world we live in today. It's not the reality of the world we're going to live in. I having worked out in California at PG&E for 16 years, the fact was, it used to be for a long time about 15% of PG&E's service territory was high fire threat. Today, it's more than 50. And you build a very different system in a high fire threat zone than you do in a non-high fire threat zone. So that's causing many of the problems they have right now. The infrastructure is just not built for the reality of the world that we have and we're going to be experiencing. And I do think that it's important for all infrastructure providers to be looking at those risks and the adaptation. I know California was, I think, way ahead on bringing climate risk into each of the utilities risk modeling. We looked a lot at that out at PG&E. But I also have to highlight, to the point about ideology that I think Michael mentioned earlier, it was really fascinating living in California and San Francisco for 16 years and then moving to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Because I think that we have to acknowledge that for much of this country, California is viewed opposite of leader. It's sort of viewed as what not to do. When I was in California and I had cities that were trying to ban natural gas, and unfortunately my company sold natural gas at the time. And then I moved here and my company doesn't sell natural gas. And let me tell you, in Western Pennsylvania, natural gas is king. It is the economic engine of Western Pennsylvania. So, who's wrong? Well, neither one of them are wrong. Each of those two jurisdictions operate in very different economic constructs, different contexts, and you can make progress from where you are. But if I came to Pennsylvania and said, here's the California model, they have all the answers, let's just do that here, there would be no followership. We wouldn't make any real change. So I do think this is where the regionalization is important. What makes a difference in Western Pennsylvania will be different. We have to figure that out here. We can't let it be driven just by ideology. It's got to be driven by the science, the math, the numbers. And Pennsylvania has undergone a tremendous carbon reduction and a tremendous carbon transformation, just as Michael said about the United States. It's almost the same story here in Pennsylvania, and it's because of the adoption of natural gas. So we can celebrate that and now work on what comes next.
Steve, I'm not jumping in, great points. And I think what you highlighted, though, is to tackle this issue, you're going to need bilateral agreements. You're going to need regional cooperation. And it's back to, if Pennsylvania is going to continue, pumping, that's not the right term, but extracting natural gas, but then you get another jurisdiction that'll plant more trees or do something else, then that works. And Elizabeth talked about the electricity flows from Canada to the US and frankly back the other way, because that helps with our reliability as well. So, in Canada, we're very frustrated because if we export LNG to China, we don't get any credit from a carbon perspective, even though we'd be replacing coal plants with natural gas, which would be good globally for reducing CO2. So, there are systems, and dare I say global systems, back to multinationalism or multi agreements, is that if we can solve those political issues, that'll help. There's no doubt that'll absolutely help, because this is a global problem.
That's a great framing. And I think it really leads us into the conversation we're already having, which is, recognizing this regional diversity in both the infrastructure as well as consumer needs and preferences along the border. Let's really dig into this. What distinctive regionalization opportunities exist that might really carry us into the next 10 to 15 years? I'm thinking about infrastructure investments, financial trends, capital flows. What should we be following? Elizabeth had mentioned some hydro that, I think New England is all but said no thanks to in some matters. We're talking about natural gas. What should we be following?
I'd love to hear opinions on green hydrogen too, guys, just to throw that into the mix.
And this is Elizabeth, but Steve and Steve or whoever like to jump in, but I'd love to hear maybe Steve Dowd if you want to kick us off.
Right. Well, I'll just pick up on what Elizabeth said. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen. My belief, it's not investable for 5-10 years or something like that. It's an experiment right now. There's a lot of work that has to be done. So that's something that I think is fascinating, but it's not really on my radar screen.
Okay, we're recording this conversation. We'll replay it in 5 years and
Absolutely.
see where we're at. Awesome.
I think there's still going to be, there's a good technology curve coming on that, but it's still a ways off. Where are the opportunities? The opportunities are, we do have to kind of follow where is the policy, who's developing the policy, where the economics. Does it make sense? Let's go back to the natural gas conversation. Does it make sense to to go do deep offshore, something like that, or does it make sense to take in oil to take oil from the Permian where it's cheap? Does it make sense to move natural gas from Montney and BC where it's cheap, or does it make sense to go to somewhere to Western Pennsylvania where it's actually very economic for that region? What makes sense, and what are the networks that you need? Where are states developing the renewable power standards? Like, some of them have been there for quite a long time. Some states are just coming along. So, it's a bit of a combination of economics and policy as to where the opportunities are going to be coming, and where we're going to find them. So, leave it to others to comment. I see Steve coming off.
Yeah, I was just going to throw out I do believe that, sort of as I think we've talked about here before, regional solutions are going to be better for all of us and for everyone. I think, Michael's example of LNG from Canada to China is a perfect example of where we can all benefit with a reduction of carbon and, utilization of resources locally. So, but I think the example I was going to highlight, in Pennsylvania now, one of the major policy questions is, should Pennsylvania join RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative from the Northeast? And in many ways, what we've actually observed is Pennsylvania utilizing a lot more natural gas and exporting cleaner energy into New York and into the Northeast, and benefiting the carbon reductions in those jurisdictions because they're not generating electricity there, they're importing it from Pennsylvania. And now if you're sitting in Pennsylvania today, half of the political spectrum in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania, as we all know, is a very purple state. It's strongly red and blue. There's half of the political jurisdiction that says, why should we join a regional alliance where we would be penalizing for exporting cleaner energy to New York and New Jersey and other places? The challenge is, a well-designed market with clear leakage rules and everything else would have actually solved that problem from the very beginning. But do we ever really find perfectly well-designed markets? It's going to be really hard. So I think the thing I worry about is until we start to see some reemergence of the political center that's willing to actually compromise on some of these issues, I really do worry that these types of regionalization conversations are going to be extremely hard to resolve because there's just not much of a political center right now to make compromise and solve some of these bigger challenges. So I have high hopes that, frankly, I hope the biggest transformation of the Biden administration coming in is actually a reemergence of a center-led coalition in this country that can work together for compromise. I mean, that's my hope. Maybe it's a pipe dream, but I hope in 5 years we come back and say, yeah, that started now. So that would be great.
Abby's in Washington.
What else did they legalize in Pennsylvania with this election there, Steve?
It's been an interesting election.
Abby, you're sitting in DC and you have, especially with some of the oil majors sitting on your board, as you're mentioning, what do you think? What does that mean for the solar industry?
It's been really interesting to think about because I have the benefit of representing businesses, right? They happen to be in the clean energy space, and many of them probably personally believe in that climate change is happening and that we should do everything we can to address it. But we're businesses. And so I feel like there's a part of us, just bluntly, that's a bit more agnostic about, 100%. You have not seen me come out for 100% clean energy, 100% renewable energy standard. We have a super aggressive goal of getting to 20% of the nation's electricity generation in the next 9 years. And that leaves 80% for other sources, right? So I feel like I have a little bit of a different hat. Sometimes people think solar and they think only the enviros or only the progressive movement, but no, we're an $18 billion sector, and we want to grow to 100 million a year. So, but I do think, just with my political hat on, that I could totally get on board with Steve Malnick's view of what success would look like, a center that gets things done. As I sit here 3 days out from a government shutdown again, a center that could get things done would be really great. It requires compromise. It requires not everyone, people having to give up some of what they think is sort of non-negotiable, but that's how it's supposed to work. Especially when you don't have all three houses, all three seats of government.
And Mike, your experience with the ISO in Canada, is it sort of a similar framing, or what are you guys?
It is. And what's interesting is that we, and I think Elizabeth mentioned this, we trade electricity and frankly energy better north-south than east-west. So back to Canada, we essentially joined because we didn't want to become Americans 125 years ago, and that's why we're the loyalist and a little bit more less risk taking than you guys who kicked out the Brits. But we haven't been able to get ourselves organized. So if you kind of think about complementary systems, you have hydro in Manitoba and fossil in Saskatchewan. Why don't they have better interties? Same thing between Alberta and BC. Very, very little. So that just needs to happen. We need better integration. I think people from the Dakotas would say the same about tapping their wind resources and sending it to California or other more fossil generated systems, because they have enormous and fantastic wind resources in the Dakotas. And back to the politics. Last I remember, it's been Iowa, Kansas, Texas. The Dakotas have been very big supporters of wind, and they're all Republican states. So back to, it's a more complex issue than a lot of people like to pretend it is. Regional cooperation, global cooperation, complementary systems, getting to a joint goal. The more we can do it, the better. I'm slightly pessimistic about it because we can't even buy beer cross province in Canada after 125 years. So I think we may still have to rely on what's been working reasonably well over the last couple of years.
So it sounds like trade might be the strong suit. Sounds like the system's set up for trade, north-south more than east-west.
It is.
Well, I think you're onto something too. We're seeing such a clean tech hub being, sort of co-anchored in Houston. It's also really exciting to see. And we have a number of questions, very good questions, queuing in the Q&A, and I did want to get to some of those. And a lot of them are actually around what we know is sort of past the renewable power sector and more towards transportation sector and opportunities for decarbonization there. And I'd love to hear any one of your thoughts on where we even begin with, even long haul transport or, sort of, more regional transport. And what do we need? What are we expecting? What are we watching?
It's kind of interesting because we've talked a lot about the decarbonization of the power sector and the things that are happening. And in many ways, I sort of view that as that's almost a done deal. Like the economics are moving that way. It's just going to take a matter of time, how fast or how slow do we make this transition, but the transition's happening. And I sort of think the most interesting next evolution is the transition in the transportation space. Because once you have that clean grid, it makes all the sense in the world to push transportation to electrification. And in doing that, just get significant value for carbon emissions and candidly for consumers of both electricity generally and of transportation fuel. And in that space, I really do think what we're seeing from the OEMs and others is, to me, pretty clear signals that we've reached a tipping point, at least on light duty vehicles, that I think we're going to see that transition move and happen. It's really so tied to storage costs and other things, which have so many other ancillary benefits and so much impact across the entire industrial sector. So I think that's going to happen. I think heavy duty is still where the question is. And does it go to hydrogen? We talked about hydrogen earlier. Is hydrogen the fuel source for heavy duty transportation? Electric, to me, it seems a little hard to get there. You got to really see some technology leaps in storage density and other things to get heavy duty transportation electric. But I think it's absolutely going to happen. Light duty, medium duty, they're going to go electric. That one I feel pretty confident 5 years from now, and that we're going to be surprised with what transformation we've seen there.
I want to call out one of the co-benefits that we don't always explicitly address when we're having carbon conversation, but that's air pollution. And in so many urban areas, especially with hotter temperature profiles, air pollution and its effects on people's asthma and air quality are really horrible. It affects the agricultural sector, it affects the human health sector, it affects the animals as well. And so that electrification story for the public health benefit isn't one that we explicitly talked about, but I just wanted to put a pin in it as we're talking about it, because I think it's very important for the long-term and society conversations that are also part of this energy story.
Anyone else have any thoughts on transportation? Otherwise, I have to ask, obviously, a question on storage. And I don't necessarily mean battery storage. I just mean grid storage.
I think Steve hit it nail on the head. I'm a bit more optimistic on hydrogen because of long haul, as well as we talked about the continuing decline in renewable power prices. So, and we're already seeing hydrogen starting to make an impact in industrial uses. So I think, as we were probably a bit surprised over the last 10 years what happened on the renewable side, I see hydrogen happening more in the 5 to 10 year, not to the scale, it's still a 30-year play, but I think it'll become much more material over the next 5 to 10 years.
I'm waiting for the storage question.
Just make it whatever you want, Abby. Just answer a storage question. You're good, girl. You're good.
I can tell you what I'm hearing sort of on the business side, right? Which is that, to Elizabeth's question, even if our government isn't figuring out that that we have this ball of crisis coming straight for our head, consumers are, right? People who live in California and are having those mandatory power outages are buying batteries. Businesses that are losing all of their food supply because there was a flood are buying batteries, and farmers are buying batteries to go with their solar systems. And so we anticipate that in the next 4 years, about 25% of all residential installations will have a battery attached to that. That's pretty remarkable if you think about it now. It's where solar used to be sort of this fringe product, and our price has come down so much. That is going to change that market. And then certainly on our utility scale customers, our utility scale companies, almost every project is bid with a solar and with a storage piece. Customer doesn't always take it, but they always want to have it bid. And then you go, okay, well, like people who are operating the grid and now have all of these either big grid assets of storage or all these distributed storage assets. And how does that change the way that we're operating the grid? And again, back to the regulatory constructs and the market rules that allow for that, right? Like we just had the FERC order 222 that allows some of this to happen. So I think storage will, it's just gonna fly by us, down the hill at the Dartmouth Skiway, and we're all gonna be like, whoa, that was quick.
Maybe I'd love to jump in on the storage point. I mean, I do agree. I agree with Abby that storage is going to transform very, very quickly. I think the technology costs for it are going to come down dramatically. I do think there's going to be a difference with storage than with solar. So solar was interesting, right? It was basically just replacing how do you generate an electron. You can use this technology or this technology. And solar offered some new opportunities of where you generate, but fundamentally it wasn't a different product. Storage, I think, is a more complicated product and doesn't really fit into any of the molds that we have today. And for example, with the possible exception of California, in most places where there's a standard net energy metering policy in place, I always tell people, why would you want to put storage at your home when you use the grid for free as a storage battery? So why would you do that? I think that storage is such a unique and powerful asset. It can deliver value up and down the energy stream, can deliver value to wholesale, it can deliver value at residential level, it can be reliability, it can be frequency control, it can be so many things. And to me, to really unleash the value of storage and to see storage significantly expand in our market, it's going to require something that is going to be extremely hard, but needs to happen anyway. And that is we have to rethink the regulatory construct for our regulated utilities, because we have got to move away from this idea that all of the costs of the grid are passed through in a variable cost of energy that someone buys. It is a 140-year-old anachronistic idea, and it does not serve us for the future. Storage is basically like replacing part of the grid, but not all of the grid. So how do we change the way we operate this system, the way we price for this system? That is going to be a nasty, nasty debate, and I'm sure Abby and I will have many disagreements on it along the way. But I do believe there's huge opportunity for us now with storage to make this about increasing the pie for everybody versus one technology versus another.
Yeah.
That sounds like we have policy, technology, and business model innovation in our future.
Absolutely.
I'd love to hear a lightning last thought from each of you before we close the panel. We're just at time. Mike, why don't we go with you? Start with you.
Transition, exciting times, complex issues, but there's a lot of things happening that give us hope.
Steve Dowd.
Yeah, I started with transition. I'll end with transition. It's the theme, and it also talks about movement of capital and where is capital going, and what's it focusing on, and that's where you'll see where the energy industry is going to be.
Abby.
Absolutely, the transition's happening. But one of my fellow panelists said this earlier, that the big goals and the fancy agreements don't mean anything if we can't actually get it built and financed. And so there is just a whole litany of sort of everyday stuff we've got to solve Steve threw out, we can just redo the entire regulatory construct. But before we do that, like land use, recycling, like there's a whole bunch of other stuff. And those are some of the things that will help us get to these aggressive goals.
Steve Malnight?
I think this transition is going to happen far faster than we think. And I also believe it is not going to be led out of Washington, D.C. Sorry, Abby. I think it's going to be led by businesses, local governments, state governments that are finding real solutions on the ground that matter to their constituents and their customers.
So it sounds like deployment-led innovation is going to be key. And I wanted to end with Elizabeth because I wanted to give her also the final word to put in a plug for an upcoming conference that I think all of us should be putting a save the date on the calendar for. Elizabeth, final thought, and then let's talk about that upcoming conference.
Thank you. It just builds on where you sit is where you stand, and understanding that energy in Houston and Alberta looks really different than it does in BC or Boston. And so ensuring that, like Steve said, like Abby said, like Steve and Michael also brought out, just our embeddedness in our rules and our context going forward. And you're all invited to our Investing in Our Energy Futures conference, because at the Irving Institute, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to leverage Dartmouth's liberal arts education and focus that lets people think and understand context while thinking about energy systems of the future. So being involved in events like this for us is such a pleasure, to be with some of the smartest people in the room. That's you guys, not us. And our Investing in the Energy Futures conference in early May, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, will be something that, April, you might want to correct me on those dates.
That's okay.
The what?
3rd through the 5th.
3rd through the 5th. I can barely brush my teeth these days. And so the 3rd through the 5th of May, but we're really trying to, again, bring these conversations and think of investing not only as capital flows, but also the people and business models that support them all and change these systems as we go forward. So I wanted to thank April for doing a super job as a moderator, keeping us all on track. Melody Birkins for spurring us all along to be able to have this conversation. Elise Allen for her super effort in getting everyone there, but also for the Canadian-US dialogue. This is one of the pieces of the Irving Institute that I like the best, is this ability to think across our systems and think bigger than just our local systems. And it's through that, our different examples, that we're going to learn and be together. So April, you're fabulous. To you.
Thank you. I think that's a perfect note to end on. And I just want to thank the panel and all of the thank yous Elizabeth already expressed on behalf of the Dickey Center, Revers Center for Energy, and our fabulous Irving Institute for Energy and Society. Have a good and wonderful evening. Thank you, panel.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone. This was a lot of fun.
Happy holidays.
Really fun.
Yeah. Bye, guys.